Hello everyone. Welcome to today's stream. My name is Ariana. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy, a Seattle-based international nonprofit with the goal of promoting consent as part of everyday life. I'm also kind of sick today. It's more like real sick, where like all my joints hurt and all my muscles kind of feel off. And I spent most of the day in the bathroom. So that's how my day's been going. Charlie was wonderfully supportive and got me some medicine. And I saved up all my energy for this today because I'm very excited about this topic and really excited to be here with you all today. Um, because I feel like this is a really important topic to talk about, and one that is, I think it's something that a lot of people kind of joke about or talk about indirectly. And, because we have all of the sort of like semi famous tropes of like talking to some racist relative at the holiday, like at Thanksgiving or whatever. But we don't really talk that much about like how do we make it less shit? How do we make it more survivable? And how do we um, maybe act in ways during the event, whatever the holiday is, that make us feel better about things afterwards. Because, for the most part, my family's pretty chill, except when they're not. Like most people's family. They can be really cool until they're not. And sometimes it's unpredictable when they're not going to be cool. And sometimes it's quite predictable and it's really just disappointing. Like I have a relative who's married to somebody who is just very difficult, and it can be really hurtful when this person is being incredibly racist towards me or other family members of mine, whether it's for being Native American or Irish, and which is also like really weird. It's kind of like, really, this is like anti-Irish racism. I mean, are you time travelers from 100 years ago? And I can get really sad that this relative doesn't stick up for anybody and kind of just like lets their partner say these things. But simultaneously, I get it because they have to continue to live with this person. But anyway, I tell this little anecdote because I kind of want to like set the stage of we all know how shit spending time, especially with a large family gathering, can be for a myriad of different reasons. And I think it's really good to talk about that. Also, hello, Rodden. Hello, Paladin Hulk. Hello, Krellin. Thank you all for being here. You're right, Paladin Hulk. They don't have to live with them, but that's a whole nother deal, which is sort of like sometimes people um, are so afraid of change or being alone or what it means for something like a relationship or a marriage to fall apart because they're scared, such that the idea of continuing to put up with certain types of mistreatment or not great behavior is much more uh, just sort of, it's just like less frightening. There's a word I was looking for, but it left me. It's much less frightening than the unknown of being alone. And for a lot of people, they can really tell themselves the story that if I'm alone, it means I'm a failure and it means bad things will happen to me and I'll be alone forever. And that's really difficult. And we've talked about this in previous streams about like the story we tell ourselves about things being really, really fundamental to creating our sense of reality. And I think it's important to talk about this. All right. So, Aradin, you said you're just getting over the effects of your COVID booster and flu shot. Uh, I hope that you feel better soon. Um, I know that both of them can be difficult. Uh, and it was, Aradin, you say, I hope I feel better because it's brutal. It was really brutal this morning. It was like every 10 minutes I had to go to the bathroom because my body was having a hard time. And now it's much better. Um, and again, welcome to the oversharing. Just kind of my vibe. Krellin, you say the solution is to not go to holiday gatherings with racist uncles. So that is one solution for sure. But we're going to talk a little bit about why there are other things that may be good solutions and other motivations we might have. It's a big, complex topic, but I'm very excited to talk about it. Aran, you said, yeah, it is sadly why I think a lot of people stay in abusive relationships. And you also said, I'm feeling much better today. I got the shots on Friday, so yesterday was rough, but today is much better. Palin Hook, either the racist goes or I go. So yeah, and I think this is another thing we can talk about today, which is if it's one of these situations where you really get to a point where you really want to set that kind of boundary, it doesn't have to be in the form of an ultimatum. It can be in the form of a boundary. And the difference between ultimatums and boundaries is we'll talk about that a little bit later because it is an important question. Sometimes people think that they're really the same thing. Sometimes people will call someone else's boundary an ultimatum. You can even see people weaponize the language of like abuse under you setting a boundary with me is abandonment or abusive or something. There's a whole host of things that can go wrong with all of these terms, but we can talk about a lot of this. So I wanted to start here with this lovely quote I found online. I don't know what Beaufort chalkboard is, but I like the quote. And the quote says, I promise you can still make a beautiful life for yourself, even if you lost years of it to trauma, mental illness, or abuse. Your story isn't over yet. And if you've been here for a lot of my streams, you know I have one of my not actually copyrighted phrases, but I could copyright it, is the only deadline in life is death. The only real one. What's the word? Slogans, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. Taglines? I don't know. I'm a little sick, so everything's a little swirly in my head today. More so than normal. Anyway, we're going to talk about how all this fits together. And I really want to talk about sort of a strategy towards when we know a stressful or a potentially stressful event is coming up. And it's normal to feel stressed, especially when it comes to relationships where we may really want to maintain the relationship. We may really want to continue our connection with a group of people. But there might be one or more people in this group that we don't want to be connected with, but we either have to choose between seeing the people we want to see or not seeing them. And it can also be a situation where it's unpredictable. Maybe certain things are going to be well supported and everything will be fine. And maybe this year your parents are going to be like, so I need to talk to you about how we don't agree with your lifestyle. And don't you know how upset you're making your mother because you have 4 boyfriends at the same time? Because there are lots of things people can they can feel ownership of related to their children. And there are loads of different reasons why we can feel stressed. Sometimes imagining what might happen can really torture us, but also remembering things that have happened. And these are sort of some of the 2 biggest sources. Imagining what might happen, especially if we go down the rabbit hole of saying, and then this, and then this, and then this, and this is how bad it will be. And we kind of make ourselves suffer twice. Or remembering things that have happened in the past and assuming that every future situation will be like this one past situation or this handful of past situations. And maybe it will be. I'm not here to say that that is not possible. I'm just saying that we can really torture ourselves with this. And the 3 different aspects I want to talk about today are before, during, and after. So before you go to an event that's going to be stressful, what can we do to sort of be good to ourselves, prepare ourselves as best as possible? During the event, and that's what we're going to spend some of the most time on, which is like some different strategies for how to deal with potential conflict or feeling yourself get sort of worked up, or different decision points and different ways of setting boundaries and other techniques we might want to use. And then after, how do we take care of ourselves after an event is over? And so let's talk about before first. So let's just think about this. What do you all think? If you know you've got a stressful event or a potentially stressful event coming up, how can you prepare yourself? How can we prepare for potentially difficult conversations? What do we think? And I'm gonna look at what I'm gonna catch up on the chat. Um, Paladin Hulk, if you're in a group with a racist and the racist isn't being asked to leave, you're in a group of racists. Yes. Aradin, yeah, I have decided not to see or interact with my relatives that are anti-vax and haven't been vaccinated. Yeah, I mean, this is also one of those things that's really tough. I think with, a combination of the pandemic still being a thing, but a lot of the world moving on from it, can be really difficult, especially as we've talked about a lot of us have um, risk factors that can make it a lot more deadly for us if we get it, or potentially more impactful. Um, and I know also sometimes I don't want to see my family taking certain types of risks. And I don't necessarily want to participate in enabling certain types of behaviors that I feel are harmful. Like, I can say to this person, I'm going to respect that you're trying to do this, but if you're going to do this, I'm going to remove myself from this situation, which is a type of a boundary setting, right? I'm not saying you can't do this thing, and if you do this thing, I'm going to do these things to you, or like here are all the like here's the punishment. Those are more like ultimatums. Um, Instead, a boundary would be saying like, you can do whatever you want. However, if you're going to do this sort of thing, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. That's more what a boundary is. Okay. Hi to Tiburon, welcome. And then Aradin, you said it may seem obvious, but just telling myself, okay, I know this is going to be stressful, but that is okay. Uh, Aradin, you said I went through this with my shots on Friday. I think it's a great way to start. Just saying like, validating yourself. When I talked about sometimes imagining what might happen being a way we can torture ourselves, that's not the same as saying being aware of the likely reality that something is going to go wrong is somehow a cognitive distortion. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if we start imagining all the different types of arguments we could possibly have and all the different ways, we could be disrespected or something could go wrong or, things could blow up and we start to make ourselves get this feeling. That's more what I'm talking about versus something that might be a bit more constructive, which is thinking about how and when do I want to set boundaries? What are the things that I'm going to take a stand on? Where are my hard lines with things? Versus at what point am I going to be more focused on keeping the peace or, not getting involved in certain things, right? Like I might not like how two relatives of mine bicker and their bickering might feel stressful to me, but I might decide, hey, it's not my job to try to manage their relationship with each other. So they can bicker all they want, and I'm just going to keep a sort of healthy, for myself, distance. Aradin or Krellin, you said, my almost 80-year-old father has COVID, so we've canceled Thanksgiving. Well, I hope, as Aradin said, that your father recovers quickly and without any sort of long-term effects. So what else are some ways that we can prepare ourselves for difficult conversations? Aradin, you said, yeah, as trying to suppress it and ignore it often just led to much more stress and anxiety, especially once the event arrives. Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of those things where there's sort of a fine line between like ruminating or obsessing or like, things that we could call cognitive distortions, like we've talked about in previous Sunday streams, and things that are actually very adaptive and helpful, which is thinking about basically using metacognition, which is thinking about how your future self is going to think and feel in a given situation, and trying to do as right by that person as possible. And try to think about like, what do I want for that person? How do I want to support that person? Does anyone else have any other thoughts about how we can prepare ourselves for difficult conversations? Like, what are we going to do to prepare for, this upcoming holiday season? if maybe we were stressful, or even just difficult conversations that are kind of might come up at work or with friends or whoever. So I think, Aran, you said identify that just because something could go wrong doesn't mean it will. That's true. I think some other things that are really useful is like increasing my capacity as much as possible. And what I mean by that is like, I really like horror, and I love like dark, depressing thrillers where like everybody is suffering. Like that's like really my jam. Like I just watched the movie The Wonder and I was like, yeah, I love this. I love this. Like everything about this movie is great. Um, However, if I know I have a stressful experience coming up, or even just a potentially stressful experience, I don't watch that kind of movie right beforehand. In fact, I'll usually spend a couple of days prior to it doing as much as I can to engineer a more positive frame of mind, which might include things like watching a lot of comedies. It's really great. I used to, as a strategy for dealing with stressful things, I used to watch a lot of Mitch Hedberg, and then try to emulate sort of his joke style when I was with friends and family as a way to like defang potentially difficult conversations or comments that could be seen as really like hurtful or spiteful. I would just turn it into a joke. So I would spend usually like a week beforehand enjoying jokes, laughing, and then just sort of putting myself into this frame of mind of approaching life and things that people say from this perspective, but also just relaxing, reducing some tension. And this kind of goes hand in hand, which is with increasing your capacity, you want to make sure that you have as many spoons as possible going into the situation because you don't want to go into it already kind of run down if you can help it. Now, this is not to say that if things start to go wrong, like, you're trying to drive to see family and your car breaks down and you lose something and all of a sudden you feel yourself getting stressed. You don't need to then double pile on the stress by thinking, oh, and now I'm going to be so worn down for when I see my family, I'm going to be even worse. You don't, it's like stressing about stressing. Like a lot of people will do this where we've got all of these articles and like news shows and stuff that talk about how stress is so bad for you. And what they often leave out is they're talking about like chronic long-term stress, not like sort of acute in the moment stresses, but sort of when it's pervasive and ongoing and sort of unrelenting over a long period of time. Um, but I know a lot of people who would get like stressed about an exam, for example, and then they would double stress thinking about how stress was going to shorten their lifespan. And cough, cough, that might have been me at one point. But then it's one of those things where we're just quadrupling our suffering. All right, what are y'all saying in chat? Aradin, yeah, you said identify that just because something could go wrong doesn't mean it will. Paladin Hulk, I can handle when things go wrong. I am strong. Yeah, mantras are also really helpful. I think people kind of knock mantras, and I think that they're actually can be really, really helpful because how we talk to ourselves, our inner voice, has a huge impact on how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about the things that happen to us, but the things we also help create. How we talk to ourselves is really important, and mantras can actually be a fun and very useful tool for changing the default sort of mode of our inner voice. They're also, they're very much a Buddhist thing, like especially in Shingon mantras, chanting mantras is like a huge part of what we do. Slightly different because in Shingon Buddhism, the mantras, they're not meaningless, but they're kind of funny because in Japanese Shingon Buddhism, they're like transliterated from like several languages into like a sound pattern that fits into Japanese. And most of the time, the people who come to it, the temple, they don't have any idea what these mantras mean. And the mantras that are usually just saying like Fudo Myo is really great. This like one deity or like some of the other deities. They're like so cool or like this one is so wise. But the point there being you don't have to actually understand what they mean. You don't even have to believe what they mean. But the act of chanting being considered to be its own benefit, which actually has some really interesting science behind it, which is relevant to what we're talking about, which is chanting, singing, even yelling into like a pillow or something is a type of activity called vagal toning. I know I've talked about this before, but the vagus nerve goes all along the inside of your torso, all the way down to the bottom of your pelvis. And it's the nerve that gives your brain information about the status of all your organs. But it's also heavily involved in regulating fight and flight responses. And also, it's really involved in migraines and things like stomach aches caused by headaches or stress. It's also involved in things like brain freeze because it can't feel pain, but it goes right along the back of the stomach. If the temperature in your stomach drops really rapidly, that status is sent up to the brain, and then you get sort of referred pain in your head. That is this feeling of cold. But because it goes along the back of the throat as well, when you do things like sing or chant or yell, it actually stimulates the vagus nerve in a way that has been found to be incredibly positive in increasing our sort of resilience to certain kinds of stressors, but also for helping the body to release sort of like held tension from past stresses and traumas, which is one of the reasons why in Buddhist monk training, doing so much chanting has a profound impact on your personality. It like changes you as a person. Because like on a usual service, we would chant for like 4 hours straight. And it would just be this really intense chanting, and you had to do all this breath control. And it's really has this huge effect on your nervous system. And I'm not saying that to get those kinds of benefits, that you have to what was I trying to say? Chant for that many hours or anything. But singing, you could sing on the car ride there or in the week beforehand. But all of these other things that sort of release built up tension, increase your sense of positivity going into it, and are soothing. Self-care, basically. So they can also include things like I like to play video games as a sort of mental palate cleanser. I especially like that for after something stressful. Usually after, for example, if I've taught a class where it demanded a lot from me, I will go and play a video game for a few hours. Or if I had a difficult meeting or I finally sent an email that I had been putting off forever because I was stressed about it, I go and play a video game as a sort of mental palate cleanser. But emotional palate cleansers can also be really useful. Let's see, what else are you all saying in chat? Aradini said the if I don't laugh, I'll cry kind of mindset. Related to Mitch Hedberg making that kind of jokes, not exactly. It's more just that like, how do I say this? You can really sort of deflate a lot of certain types of small level interpersonal bullshit through a well-employed joke. It's not the only tool, but for my sort of neurodivergent brain, I have a hard time with not always responding to people very, very literally. And I think there was something recently where like someone made a comment that was, oh yeah, I was eating lunch in a park with family when we were back in Boston, and we had talked about how this new report came out that says that the average person eats about a credit card's worth of plastic a week from just like industrial waste and microplastics from packaging and everything. And the person I was talking to, he tried to make a joke saying, oh, well, we'll just evolve to become the kind of people who can digest plastic, so it's not a big deal. And like, that's whatever. But instead of responding to it in like a more like socially sophisticated way, I was like, actually, no, that doesn't work because that won't create any evolutionary pressure. Like, it has to be something that would interfere with our ability to live long enough to have offspring, to successfully produce offspring, or offspring would not live long enough to have their own children. And only those sorts of things tend to create evolutionary pressures. So things that just slowly build up in our bodies and cause dysfunction down the road are not things that actually we're likely to evolve out of just through natural selection. Like one of the reasons why we get cancer and age is basically because all that stuff happens after we've already usually had our children. Not always, but usually. And that's the just in the middle of like a, casual chit-chatty lunch conversation where people were not talking about anything very serious. I just was like, here we go. I'm going to just come in with like a 5-minute chat about some science facts because that's who I am as a person. And that's just how my brain responds to things. But one of the other things I've learned as like a tool for social effectiveness, but also just like tension reduction, is how to make jokes to respond to things where I don't necessarily want to go in that direction. Because that's really useful. Well, it's not actually, for social functioning, that's not actually the most useful characteristic to have because people tend to just think it's weird. And I'm sure everyone in the audience who's neurodivergent can relate to that, or is just a weirdo nerd. There's a huge overlap. That Venn diagram is almost a circle. But there are times where that is not the energy I want to give to somebody, especially if I have certain relatives that might say things just to try to get a rise out of me. And I don't want to give them that satisfaction. I used to, and sometimes like I'll smack down things people say, and then they'll do the sort of like Schrodinger's douchebag, like it's a joke or not a joke, depending on how you respond to it. They will definitely do that, where they're like, "Oh, I only said that because I was trying to get a rise out of you. Look at how much you just explained to me, like how bigoted what I said was," and that's fine. I'm comfortable with dealing with people who act that way if I like them and I want to maintain a relationship with them in other ways. And, and it's not like it's usually for small things, but I don't let small things go. But there are times where I don't want to go in that direction. I don't have the energy for it. I don't have the desire. I don't care enough about the relationship to give that part of myself to them, or I'm just not in the mood. And employing a good joke is a really good way to equally say to somebody, hey, the thing you just said is completely absurd and you should feel silly for saying it, but without me having to give them a 20-minute presentation on, greenhouse gases or eugenics or something. And then I can just be like, And so a joke is really useful. And it's also just a fun skill to develop. So going back to the idea of like how we can prepare before the event, basically, especially if you're going to go home for something like Thanksgiving this week, take as much time as you can this week just for yourself. Really work on things that are going to make you feel good. For some people, that can be things like exercise. I know for me, I always feel at my best when I'm regularly doing yoga. It's one of those things that I fall out of the habit of all the time, unfortunately, because it always makes me feel amazing. And I just find little like 10-minute YouTube videos and follow along, like literally just 10 minutes of it, because I don't really have the time or the focus for something longer. And so I would do something like that, really sort of dedicate just for this week. I'm going to absolutely do at least 10 minutes of yoga a day. I would make sure that I really prioritize sleep. I have a tendency to do like revenge procrastination, where because I'm so busy during the day, I kind of like put all of the things that I wanted to do during the day off until the very late evening, and then I end up staying up later. But I would, really try hard not to do that this week. And unless that was something that actually made me feel really rejuvenated. Hi, Whistler, welcome. Um, and Oh, hold on. I wanted to see what Aradin you said. Oh yeah, the stress leading to stressing out about the stress can be a nasty loop. Yes, and then Mythbusters did a thing on swearing, whether they are a person or global swear words, and how it can actually reduce pain. Yeah, I mean, I will definitely say just very anecdotally, swearing makes me feel very good. Um, yeah, and there are you can do whatever sort of works for your personality. This is just sort of what I would do. Get a little bit of physical activity. I would watch a bunch of comedies to put me in a mindset that I'm not normally in. Like I said, I love those like dark, sad things where everybody's miserable and most of them die. You know, that's just sort of my jam. I will watch that same kind of thing over and over again. Like I'm watching 1899 right now. It's from the same people who made Dark. And Dark, I was like, I don't normally like time travel stuff, but this is about like community traumas just repeating themselves over and over again. This is totally my thing. I'm going to watch this. I wouldn't want that this week if I were stressed about going home to see family. I would spend some time doing things that put me in a very positive state of mind. Um, I would love your TTRPG recommendation, Rodden. Some other things that I would do, like I said, exercise a little bit, try to prioritize my sleep. I might do other things that make me feel some kind of sense of mastery. This is some sort of basic sort of distress tolerance skills. I have a PDF of all of the distress tolerance sort of like competencies from DBT somewhere, but let me just look it up. Distress tolerance. Yeah, as you can see, I've even bookmarked these things many times. But let's talk about it a little bit. Let me just sort of rework the size of this. So these are some things that distress tolerance is basically a skill set from dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a really great therapy from the cognitive behavioral family. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, but with even more Buddhism preserved in the underlying philosophy. And I'm going to zoom in, so hopefully it actually is a little easier to read for you all. So this is the link. I'll put it in the chat. Distress tolerance skills. And you don't have to like all of them. They don't all work for everybody. I was once as a teenager, I was in like a teen stress support group, and they all got really into knitting as like our distress tolerance activity. And every time I tried to knit, I was like, I just want to throw these knitting needles across the room. I can't stand this. So like not everything works for everybody. You got to figure out kind of what works for you. But some things that are really good are TIP, which is for temperature, intense exercise, pace breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. So this is stuff that's really neurologically based. So temperature, you can play with temperature to reduce stress. This is really useful in the moment. This is also going to be something useful if you're really stressed about going home. And temperature can be things like splashing cold water on your face, or squeezing ice cubes is something that's really useful, or chewing ice cubes. Temperature has a huge effect on our nervous system, and how the body reacts to different temperature changes has a huge impact. So, for example, if you have like a sink or a bowl and it's full of cold water and you put your face into it and you kind of hold your breath and you put it in there for like 10 to 20 seconds, it will activate something called the mammalian dive reflex, which is sort of this vestigial-ish sort of cascade of behaviors within our body that have to do with our nervous system and our vascular system, that has to do with when mammals that are aquatic or semi-aquatic dive, how to protect the organs, how to conserve oxygen, all this other stuff, and it affects everything. And it's actually really useful if you ever are having tachycardia or an arrhythmia. It's very, very useful for that. Like my doctors had me doing that for a while to see if it helped with some of my heart problems, because it basically resets a bunch of the nervous system and puts it into this different mode. Um, and here they're kind of just talking about like when you're upset, our bodies often feel hot, but there's a lot more sort of science to how temperature can be an incredibly useful tool. You can get some of that from just drinking a bunch of very cold water very quickly. It's not as effective as putting your face in cold water, but it will still be good if you can't put your face in cold water. And you can also do things like, yeah, like hold an ice cube because it creates really intense sensations. It really can give you something to focus your mind on, and that can be really useful. Intense exercise, it's one of those things where like everybody always recommends exercise. Like, trust me, I felt the irony when I was like, yoga, that's the thing that's going to help you, because that's what everybody always says. And like, it's like when people say to someone with ADHD, like, oh, you would be so benefited from getting a planner. And we're always just like, if it were that easy, I would have done it by now. And also, once I found a planner that was actually designed by and for people with ADHD, shout out to Planner Pad, and started using it like every single day without fail, it completely changed my life and I became a lot more able to manage things. So it's one of those things where it's like, oftentimes when people give you this advice, it's actually they're kind of dismissing you and writing you off, but simultaneously, it's not bad advice. So it's kind of both at the same time. And it's not a cure-all. It's not going to just make everything better. But intense exercise can be really good. It has just a tremendous number of benefits. Not for everybody. There are plenty of people for whom exercise is actually contraindicated. Next is paced breathing. This is another thing you can do in the moment, which is things like any kind of paced breathing technique. And it can be like mindful breathing, where you just really focus on your breath. It can be box breathing, which is where you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, and then you hold that for 4 seconds, and you kind of do it like that. There are lots of cute GIFs that will kind of like move in relationship to that timing. There are lots of different ways to do any kind of paced breathing. This is also really similar for having the effect of affecting your nervous system. And there was a really good article that just got published, I think, in PLOS One, I think it might have been, that was about how like intentional breathing modulation has like a whole cascade of effects in neuro activity modulation. So like you can really affect your cognition through paced breathing, basically, or just sort of taking conscious control over your breathing. And then paired muscle relaxation basically is intentionally tightening and relaxing your muscles. It's sort of one of the reasons why for some people a way to just tolerate stressful things is to do something like bounce their leg. It's both a sensory stimulation, but also it is sort of paired muscle relaxation. And these are things that you can do very easily. And you can also do something like go outside for some air for a minute to cool down. Or you can, while you're at home visiting family, do some, stretches in your room or a few jumping jacks or something if you can't really do intense exercise. There are lots of things that you can do. And you can, if you're sitting at a dinner table, for example, it's often pretty easy to just like flex your calf muscles repeatedly, or your quads or something, or even your butt. People probably notice that you're wiggling, but it's fun. And these are things that you can really do. There's lots of ways you can just sort of do these in the moment, but some other things there's this other acronym called ACCEPTS. It's really cute. And it's a combination of different things you can do to help you deal with stressful things, activities that take your mind off of stuff and make you feel good, like reading a book, making something, calling a friend. This is something I recommend to people a lot, which is that if you're having a really hard time in life, doing something like just sending a friend a nice message. Like I do this a lot. I'll send people messages just saying, I'm thinking of you. And that's because I want them to know I'm thinking of them. But it also tends to feel good to us to sort of reach out and say something kind to somebody. Um, and it's sort of mutually beneficial. Not everybody likes it. If you've got friends who are like, don't ever do that. I don't ever want compliments. Like, definitely respect that. But, you know, it can be useful. Contributing. This is something that a lot of people do, especially a lot of people who can be very socially anxious. They will give themselves tasks. So somebody who might feel really anxious in a social situation might do something like, I'm going to go wash the dishes. Well, everyone's having this conversation I don't necessarily feel great about. But we can also do this sort of beforehand, do things that make us feel useful and make us feel like we're capable of doing things. So, doing nice things for other people. It says things like helping cook dinner, mowing someone's lawn, baking cookies for somebody. You know, ignore what Twitter was saying this week, where people were basically like, if you ever make food for a neighbor, you're basically doing the same thing as like rounding them up and sending them to a forced labor camp or something. It's not the same. It's perfectly normal to do that. But you always have to recognize they might say no to whatever you're offering them. Or they might say yes only to be polite. And so it's always good to let people know they don't have to take the food from you. But it can be a nice way to do things. And it builds up our sense of our own esteem. And so, if you're going to go into a situation where maybe your family or whoever you're spending the holidays with might devalue you in a lot of ways and might tear down some of your esteem, doing things this week beforehand to build up your esteem can be really, really protective. Because you can fall back on that. If somebody is saying, like, oh, you're a piece of shit, or like, you never do this, or you're always this, or whatever, you can counter that with, uh, okay, I recognize that my family thinks this way about me, but that's not all that I am. I do these other things for people too. And uh, all right, I'm sorry, I just saw what you said that your doctor looked at your scoliosis, said exercise and eat better, and then left. I mean, that's really just, yeah, that's like the thing doctors say when they don't have anything else to say. But it's also one of those things where it's like, one, do they actually know how much you're exercising and what you're eating? Two, are those things that are actually possible for you? Three, like, are there other things that maybe need to be investigated first? You know, like I've developed scoliosis that is entirely because I have a connective tissue disorder. And it's like, there's no degeneration, it's adult onset. It's pretty minor right now, but it might get worse as I get older. And there are things I need to do to take care of it, like always make sure certain muscles stay strong and I don't let certain weaknesses and imbalances build up. And there's other things that it's like, if it gets worse, it gets worse. All I can do is offset some of the impact of that. I think that a lot of people would be really benefited from seeking out doctors of osteopathic medicine. So they have to pass all the same boards and they do the same residencies as MDs, but the philosophy behind the medical practice tends to be a little bit more holistic. And I've had pretty good experiences. Okay, continuing. Yes, it is massive hyperbole, Rodden and Whistler. I also think, yeah, I mean, I like Twitter a lot. I've gained a lot of benefit from it. There's definitely things where like discourse on Twitter has really pushed my thinking forward or like sharpened ideas or helped me, you know, in certain ways, finding certain community. I've made friends through Twitter. And also, as I always say, you got to be careful because it can also rot your brain. Okay, so doing things to build up your esteem this week can be really useful. Comparisons are also something that you can use, but I always recommend using them sparingly. They work for some people. They make a lot of people feel worse. I remember when I was learning in university about the sort of like ins and outs of DBT, and it was very interesting to me that they recommended comparisons, which is basically saying to yourself, like, if you start to get into the mindset of like, this is the worst thing ever, uh, it is the worst thing ever, I'm a terrible person, or like my whole life is shit, like recognizing that other people have it worse than you. And the only way that this is useful is something I know I've mentioned before. I think I even mentioned it last Sunday, but that one of the sort of cognitive effects of things like depression is more sort of self-referential thinking, which is not meaning that you become more self-centered. It means that you sort of start to take yourself and your understanding of yourself out of a context. So you start to view yourself in complete isolation from the context that's around you, and it makes it a lot easier for you to think really negatively about yourself and your life circumstances, to feel a lot more alone. And one of the recommendations to counter that is to do what you can to reinsert your sense of self into context. Comparisons can be a tool for that, but you really have to use them with caution, because people can also do it in a way to just beat up on themselves. Like, don't try not to say to yourself, oh, you're such a little baby that you would feel bad about this, when other people are like, that's the kind of shit that, dismissive people say to you. That's not what we're trying to get you to do. It's to more like say, okay, I'm in a context, and the context is right now I'm at home with my family, and it's a difficult dinner, and it will also end at some point, and I will go back to, you know, this other situation that is better, or, that kind of thing, if this makes sense. Another thing you can do is push things away. This is actually, people really give pushing away things a bad rap. People are kind of like, assume that pushing away is the same thing as bottling things up. And we also assume that bottling things up is inherently bad. But there's no one right way to deal with everything, first and foremost. But there are things that work for other people. Bottling things up all the time is not necessarily helpful and healthy. Like, people who have a tendency not to process their feelings are much more likely to have things like heart attacks and strokes and other issues, because it has an effect on the body. There's this book called The Body Keeps the Score, if you want to know more about how stress and trauma and like not processing emotions, or being experiencing things that are so intense that you can't process it all, how it actually affects our physiology quite intensely. I recommend that book. However, you can also say, I don't have the ability to deal with something yet. So someone just said something to me, or something just happened, and I don't have the time to deal with it right now. I've had periods of time in my life that were really stressful, really difficult, and I kind of got through them with two things: remembering that it would end at some point, that the situation I was in was not going to last forever, and keeping myself really embedded in a context of like, this is a situation that exists now, and it may exist for years. In some cases it did, but it will eventually end. And then also keeping myself so busy that I didn't have time to think about what was happening until I was out of the situation and could process it safely. And that is what got me through those things without falling apart during it. And it was very useful. Um, uh, Let me see, what else are you all saying? Aradin, if you can avoid it, don't internalize the things crappy people tell you, or even things that well-meaning and kind people tell you that are still hurtful. It can still be things that perfectly kind and nice people say, things that are really cutting, unintentionally even, and we have to be really careful with that. One of my first things is like, don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't go to for advice. And like, when I get, for example, like hate online, every once in a while, people retweet something I've said on the internet and then like talk trash about me. And I'm just like, haha, engagement. It fuels me. Like I said something that was bothered you so much that you had to add to it. Like I try to turn it around into something positive. Someone did this to me recently because I dared to suggest that like maybe not every networking event should be centered around drinking alcohol. Because even though I drink and I enjoy drinking, not everybody does. And also it gets really boring and it would be nice. And like there are people who are alcoholics or, recovered and they don't want to be around alcohol. Like just have some variety. And someone just said that I was like a selfish piece of shit. And it's like me, me, me. And I was like, okay, I'm actually not even talking about myself, but I appreciated that someone got annoyed enough. Which means you can also sort of transform something, trying to look at it or experience it or analyzing it from a different perspective, even if it feels kind of false at first. You can fake it till you make it for a lot of things. Um, and then Paladin Hulk, people who own vineyards always bottle things up, and I think it's disgusting. I don't like wine. Nice joke, Aradin. Yeah, I did that right after my mother passed away, and honestly, I don't think any networking event should be centered around alcohol. Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it. That should be saved for after parties and similar things. I mean, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like when things are centered around like guys golf, it's like, okay, well then like I'm not able to do this, right? And it's anyway, but pushing things away, completely a thing. You can do it. You can go into the situation and just say, I'm not really going to think about it. I'm not really going to rise up to it. I'm going to sort of compartmentalize. I'm going to keep things in a little box until I can go home and I can unwrap that box and play with what's inside of it. And otherwise, it's all going to go right into this little box and I'm going to think about it afterwards. It's not a skill that you can develop overnight, but it's one that I really value. Whistler, you said comfort the disturbed and disturbed the comfortable. I mean, I think that's also one of those things that that is kind of the way I approach a lot of things in life, which is that if somebody says something that I think is really harmful and they're going to enjoy too much me trying to correct them, or they're not going to actually respect it, or they're not actually going to engage with it in good faith, I just come back to them with something usually absurd or vulgar. I did this a lot as a teenager. I think I've told plenty of stories on here about how I was a little bit of a handful as a teenager. And my dad, for example, really wanted me to have good manners, but he would do certain things that I found to be really absurd. Because as a kid, I never really accepted things that I was told I'm supposed to do because I'm female or AFAB, which means assigned female at birth, because I was kind of like, if you keep having to remind me to do this thing that's supposed to be the essential nature of being a girl, there seems to be a contradiction here. So anyway, one of the things they would constantly tell me to do is to sit like a lady. Because I like to sit bisexual, meaning I can't sit normally in chairs. Half the time below where you can see my camera, I've got like my legs up on my desk, or like one leg up on my desk, or I've got one folded up, or like, I sit on my legs. I just cannot sit normal in a chair. And anyway, when my dad would say to me to sit ladylike, my go-to response was to always put both of my feet up on the table like I was at the gynecologist's office in the stirrups, and I would say, I never feel more ladylike than when someone's staring directly at my cervix. My dad only asked me to do that a couple of times before he was like, no, she's just going to do that again, and it's embarrassing. So I would do it in public. But that was a way of setting a boundary creatively. Not necessarily the most skillful, but it's my style. It's my style. I'm not, and I do want to say that, like, I'm never going to try to argue that everything I do is like perfectly consensual or like perfectly ethical or whatever. I'm just a person. and I have responses to things, and I can be a bit of a cheeky asshole sometimes. And yeah. Also, Whistler, yeah, should is one of the most toxic words in the English language. I definitely think so. I definitely agree. And yeah. All right, and I've just heard of way too many awful stories about networking events, usually due to the alcohol aspect. Oh yeah, for sure. There, it can get really sexual harassy or just like inappropriate because of alcohol. It's a whole thing. Okay, thoughts you can practice this week replacing negative, anxious thoughts with activities that busy your mind, such as saying the alphabet backwards or doing Sudoku. If I'm in like a meeting that I'm having a really hard time paying attention to, I might do something like, play solitaire or organize the icons on my desktop or something, because it's just enough of a distraction that actually helps me focus. But if it's been a stressful meeting, it's often also really good because I don't have to think about everything. But these are things that you can replace it. You don't necessarily have to replace it with like a different sort of like positive thought. Like that's not always accessible to people. It doesn't always feel validating. But you can, if you start to recognize, if you catch yourself thinking something that's really negative, especially about yourself or about the world or about other people in general, these things that are very reality making for us, you can just say, okay, I recognize I'm having this thought and I'm going to just say the alphabet backwards in my head now. Or I'm going to like count to 100 in French or any language that you maybe took in high school. I'm going to try to remember this, or I'm going to like do some flashcards or something. Like I often have like little flashcard stacks with me. So then I can be like, oh, I'm studying because it's kind of hard for people to argue with studying. I mean, sometimes they can't. People can argue with anything, but distracting myself. And another thing you can use is different sensations. So it's really common for people who want to have an on the go thing to have like a hair elastic or a rubber band that you can keep around your wrist, and you can just sort of like slowly tap it or gently tap it, or you can even do it a little snap, because it's not going to damage you. It's just going to create sensation. For some people, that little like prickle snap can feel really soothing, because anytime we have any sort of like mild pain, we release endorphins. So it's one of the reasons why eating really spicy food can make you feel really, like I get basically high from eating really spicy food. I just get like this huge endorphin rush and I feel amazing. But we can do that with other things. Same thing with like holding ice cubes. That's one of those things. And we can also use other sensations, like I might keep a little vial of lavender oil with me, and if I'm feeling stressed out, I just like take the cap off and I smell it a little bit. Or I might put some nice perfume on, and so like I can just smell my wrists as a way to sort of reframe my senses. You can also get little things to fidget with. Fidget spinners kind of like really gave this whole idea a bad rap. Because they were like a total gimmick and they were overhyped and actually really poorly employed and not really very useful for this thing. But it can be something like a worry stone. A worry stone is a stone you can get that has like a little groove in it. And so you can hold it in your hand, kind of concealed, and then rub your thumb inside the groove. And it's usually very pleasing feeling. But you can also do something like have a nice piece of cloth or silk. Like I like to wear really soft fabrics. And so if I feel really stressed, I can just sort of like slowly caress the fabric with my fingers. If you get really overstimulated by these kinds of things, definitely don't do these. And it can also do things like I often like to wear earplugs because I can get really overstimulated by certain types of sound. So even at a dinner party, I might have earplugs in and I may hide it with my hair, but a lot of the time I don't. And I just am like, nope, I'm sensitive hearing. Got a headache right now. My ears are sensitive, whatever. And then it kind of dampens it all. And then this is what accepts is. There's other things here like the improve, which can be using imagery where you can imagine different things and use sort of like positive thinking to create something. Find ways to find meaning in difficult situations. This can be sometimes a little bit like self invalidation. You don't have to try to find a silver lining in everything, but it can be helpful. Um, for some people, prayer is really useful. Relaxation, like engaging in intentional relaxation. Focus on one thing in the moment, trying to stay in the moment as much as possible. One of the things is sometimes when I'm stressed about an interaction I might have with a person, I start to get really worked up about interactions I had in the past with them, or even during the time where I'm interacting with someone, I might start being really focused on things that happened in the past. And so, one way I can deal with that is say to myself, okay, yes, this is maybe thematically related, or this is something that is like I understand why I'm thinking about this, but I'm not in that situation right now. I'm in this other situation right now. And then I kind of will just label for myself, not label, but like name for myself what's the situation I'm in. Like right now, I'm sitting at my desk, I'm live streaming, I'm talking to people on the internet, and I'm in my apartment, and my like kitty is sleeping right here. I'll make it so you can all see her. She's super cute. And, like I'm, in my apartment building, and I'll kind of think about what that looks like. And I'm in like Vienna, and I'm in Austria, and I'm in Europe, and I kind of like enlargen it out. And then I then come sort of back to myself and I say, and here's what I'm doing right now, and here's when this situation will end. And I kind of do it like that as a way to keep myself from getting too wound up about other things. We can also do this through difficult conversations with family, where sometimes a common thing that happens is you start to have one difficult conversation with someone, and then they want to bring up all of the past things that have happened between you and them that were not great. And if you catch yourself doing this, try not to do it. Try to stop yourself. But if someone starts doing it to you, one of the things you can do is just validate it and then redirect it. So if someone, like when I was a kid, anytime I got into an argument with one of my parents, they would just start to get on my case about how I had spent too much of my money for my first job on video games and like I should have saved it for college, as though that like, $800 was going to mean much. But anyway, um, what I would do in those cases is say to them, you know what, like, I definitely understand that this is something that bothered you and still bothers you, it seems. And I think that this is something we really should have a conversation about at some point. But right now, we're talking about this thing. So let's set aside the conversation about how much money I spent on video games so it can have the time that it deserves. Uh, and right now, we're going to focus on this. Or if it's a conversation that I've had with someone a million times and I don't want to have it again, and I've told them that, I can just set a boundary there and say, hey, listen, I understand that you feel like this conversation is not resolved, but I've said to you in the past, I don't want to go back over this thing. And if you insist on trying to go back over it with me, I'm going to leave the conversation. Perfectly good way to do that. So these are all these different sort of things you can do this week to, especially self-soothing activities, to bolster yourself up before you go into a stressful situation. And this article here is like a pretty good introduction to these things. Dialectical behavioral therapy is really useful, especially I think the distress tolerance skills are really helpful. So we talked about a little bit about what we can do before we go to a stressful situation, and some of the skills we also talked about how they can be used during. A couple other things I want to talk about for during. Let me come over here. Let me just resize this so it looks a little nicer for you all. Nope, that's not what I'm trying to do. So I've talked about this before many times, but if you're new here or you want a reminder, because it's always good to be reminded of this skill, is to remember that in any interpersonal situation, there are like three main possible goals: getting what you want, maintaining self-respect, and maintaining the relationship. And so most of the time, these things are in harmony with each other. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you might have to sacrifice one or two in order to get the other one. So if my main goal is to maintain my self-respect, let me back up for a second. It's often good before you get into a situation to think about what is the goal I want to prioritize in it. What is the goal that I want to stay focused on? Because it's going to really affect how I'm going to act. If my goal is to just like survive and to come out as unscathed as possible, that's going to be trying to get what I want. And I'm going to behave really, really differently than if my goal is I'm going to throw down and call everybody on their bullshit because I'm not going to tolerate any of it. Or it's going to be really different than, I know that, X relative is really difficult, but I know how much it means to like my mom to still have a relationship with this person. And I don't want to add more stress and tension to my mom's life. And so I'm going to prioritize having the best possible relationship I can with my mom and not get into an argument with my uncle or something. And these are all perfectly valid. There is no one right way to approach this. You are not doing something wrong if one of these is your priority and not the others. They're all equally okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do for each of these things. So if maintaining self-respect is the priority, you want to sort of focus on thinking about what are the things that are important to you? Where are the sort of lines you want to draw? What does maintaining self-respect look like to you? There are things where I'm perfectly okay with having a disagreement with somebody about something very abstract. And for the most part, if my family says something that I think is not totally appropriate, like recently someone was telling me a story about something and the story was actually interesting, but they kept adding a detail that I took issue with. Or they were assuming that the person in question in the story didn't really need to use the mobility aid that they were using. And they felt like they had all this evidence, especially because the person could like get up and walk around. And that wasn't even the point of the story they were telling. They felt that it was just adding to the context of why the person they were talking about was so terrible. But for me, I'm not the kind of person who lets that slide. So I needed to stop them and say, hey, listen, the vast majority of people who use mobility aids are perfectly capable of walking around without them. There are many reasons to use mobility aids. And the fact that if we see someone who, say, is a wheelchair user stand up out of their wheelchair to get something, we have this sort of myth that a wheelchair means paralyzed, no motion, that kind of thing, or like some sort of limb difference that would, preclude somebody from being able to move without the wheelchair. We have this stereotype, and that actually leads to a lot of harassment. And while I don't think this person would have ever done that, I still was just like, I have to call it out. I can't have you tell me this story and continue to include this detail when it's genuinely both not relevant to the story you're telling and also kind of bullshit and potentially harmful to people. Like it's an idea that I need to push back against. However, with that person, with most of my family members, they know 10,000% who I am as a person. They know what to expect from me. And they know that when I challenge them on these things, it comes from a good place. And they also know that that's what you have to be able to tolerate that to have a relationship with me. So for me, that is not something that is like a risk against self-respect, right? However, if the person were to start to kind of like intentionally bring up things, like I have some relatives who really, really like to call female dogs bitches because they, for some reason, think that because I'm a feminist, I'm gonna like take issue with that. And I'm like, you're just juvenile. Like, that's all I think. That's just a juvenile thing to do. And they're trying to get a rise out of me. And so, like, for me, there, maintaining my self-respect is more important, which is I'm just going to ignore it. And sometimes they get disappointed that I ignore it and then have to be like, oh, well, I only referred them to as bitches because that's the actual technical name. And I'm just like, yeah, it is. And I don't even engage. So that's the difference here. Like, there are things where you can have a situation where there is some tension or conflict in a conversation that is not necessarily the same thing as needing to set aside self-respect, but it can be. Okay. So, let's go ahead and I want to check Paladin Hulk, you said self-respect hype, and also I hate those things where people assume the worst in others. Yeah, and I definitely know some people who are like particularly offended and upset about the idea of like someone getting away with something. And I'm just like, what do you care? What do you care? If they're like, you don't actually know, first of all. And even if they are getting away with something, getting some kind of special treatment or whatever, the fact that they would go to these kinds of lengths to get it probably means their lives are pretty shit. And just be thankful you're not them. That's just leave it at that. And that's not very helpful for those people. They just want to feel like there are bad people in the world or there are people who are getting away with things. Everybody's got their thing. That's my also defanging statement when I don't really want to engage. Got that from one of my ex-girlfriends. It was brilliant. And it was great when we were out together and someone would be saying some bullshit and she would just be like, "Yo, everybody's got their thing." And I would just be like, haha, I know what you actually mean. Anyway. Uh, and then Aradin, you said invisible disabilities are rough. My mother had that. She had a disabled parking pass, but often felt bad about it as she wasn't in a wheelchair or obviously disabled at a glance. Um, and then you asked Aradin, do they call all donkeys asses? No, no, of course not. Because the only reason why they're doing this like thing is because they want to get a rise out of me. And maybe when I was like 12, it did. Because I would just be like, why do you want to get a rise out of me related to this? Like that was the way I would respond to it. It's like, why is this a thing? Like, do you somehow think it is laughable that I am a feminist? And really what it was is that they thought I was cute when I got angry or flustered. But I was kind of like, okay, but like, I'm not going to give you that power over me. So no. Um, Paladin Hulk, you said, I had a conversation where people were assuming the worst in asylum seekers from Yemen because husbands would travel here first and then the wife and kids would wait there, whereas people from Ukraine would do the reverse. The husbands would stay and fight. If that's even true, it proved to them that Muslims were bad somehow. You know, it's just so sad. I mean, it's ridiculous. Also, like, you know, how do I want to say this? We live in a very patriarchal world, and in a world that treats women and femmes and AFABs, any sort of constellation of anything feminine, as very disposable and as property. And simultaneously, we have a particular insidious way of devaluing men and mask people's lives. And like, we have a tendency to really want to humanize if we're going to humanize the refugee, it's going to be the white or the light-skinned refugee who are a lot more likely to feel compassion if they're a woman or a child. But if they're a single adult man, asylum claims are often denied. And that to me is like heartbreaking. Like it really, really upsets me. I know this is a total tangent, but we really do devalue everybody's lives. And the brunt of it can definitely be felt more strongly in certain towards certain people and in certain cases. And you know, I think that yeah, it's not, I'm not trying to talk about the oppression Olympics, but I'm also not trying to deny like statistics on different types of violence. I'm just saying that like the whole dominator model of reality and even patriarchy itself does not protect anybody. It really doesn't. We're all disposable under this mindset. Um, okay, so let's continue with this. This here is basically also something you can look at from either dialectical behavioral therapy or nonviolent communication. And other just sort of communication theory talks about this a lot. So if I'm going to be really focused on maintaining self-respect, this is going to include making sure I respond to scenarios in ways that I feel good about after the fact. So if for me, what feels good is to tell people, they're ridiculous and that like they're absurd and that like what they're saying is, absolute bullshit and just like completely, flipping the table and walking away. If that's really what's going to make me feel like I maintained my self-respect well, and if I don't do that, I'm going to feel like I sort of violated my own internal boundaries. Maybe if I want to be really consensual about things, I just don't go. But, because like you don't necessarily want to behave non-consensually towards people just because they're behaving non-consensually towards you. But like, I want to make sure that I don't say things that I don't actually mean, and I don't say things that I'm going to regret later. So that's for me, part of how I maintain my self-respect is acting in ways that are in line with my identity. So part of my identity is I am unwavering in my ethics. And the people who like me really like this about me. And there are some people who really like it when, the thing I'm arguing for is something that it affects them, and then they get kind of squirrely about it when I turn this same gaze onto them when they do something that I feel like is not okay. And then there are other people who like completely hate me for it. And I accept all of those things. And because that's such a core of my identity, it's why I don't let things slide. Like if someone's telling me a story and they're saying something small, and I'm like, it's small, except it's not, because underneath that idea, I feel like there's all these roots, and I take a very like systems thinking approach to it. I'm gonna want to call it out. I'm gonna want to go to there and just be like, I'm not totally good with this, and we need to unpack it a little bit. And if somebody says, hey, I really don't want to have this conversation with you right now, I might say like, okay, but I want to talk to you about this later, or when can we talk about it? Or, if they're like, no, I have to respect this person's boundaries. But I can also say, okay, if you're not going to talk to me about this, then like, I don't want to have these types of conversations with you anymore. Like, I will not engage with this. Also perfectly fine. And maintaining self-respect also has to be things like being gentle with yourself. Um, you have to be gentle with yourself, use an easy manner with yourself, and make sure when you say things to people, ask yourself, is it necessary to say this? Is it actually true? Is it kind? And also, is it cringe? That's the other thing. I always ask yourself, like, could this thing be cringe that I'm about to say? It's one of the things that I think I put into the How to Be a Good Ally article on Patreon, because it's a lot of times people say really cringy things in attempts to be an ally, and it actually is just ends up often making more work for the person you're trying to be an ally to. And then if my goal is to maintain the relationship, I'm going to want to use a very easy manner, even if I'm disagreeing with someone. Maintaining the relationship being your priority does not mean that you don't stand up for yourself or that you don't like ever push back against things. It doesn't have to be these extremely siloed things. There's a ton of overlap between all of these. But I want to use a gentle and easy manner. I want to listen for understanding, and I want to validate the person. Remember, validation does not equal agreement. I can validate someone even if I disagree with them. And it's also possible to validate someone without needing to match things like inflammatory language. So this is really difficult because not everybody wants to validate things. But validation, again, I really need to stress it does not mean agreement. Validation means that I recognize that the feelings you are having are the feelings that you are having. And I'm not telling you that you're not having those feelings, that this thing is true for you and how you feel, even if I disagree with, like, the logic behind it or your understanding of reality, whatever. I can still say, I recognize that you're having these feelings and I see that. That's what validation really is about. Um, let's see here. Aradan, people will look for any excuse to justify their own prejudices. Yeah, society has narrowed masculinity to one specific view of it, which is sad. Aradan, you also added, I saw someone that had alpha male in their Twitter name, and it made me laugh as how insecure do you have to be to do that. Yeah. Paladin Hulk, when people say they're an alpha, I assume they mean the reboot from Power Rangers. Um, yeah, when people say that they're an alpha, so this is the way I approach a lot of these things is I try to look at like what the core message someone is trying to send. Like what is the thing behind the words? And so if someone's telling me they're an alpha, they're telling me that in order to feel safe, they need to feel as though that they're in control, which can be very dangerous because if people need that, they can often take things like not obeying them as a sign of disrespecting them, which obeying and respecting are not the same thing. But they can also, I assume, I think that they're more likely to become really hostile or potentially violent. But it also tells me that there are probably some fears that they have there. They're afraid of not being enough. They're afraid of their masculinity being in question. They might be quite homophobic, but that they are fundamentally operating from a place of fear and fear that is only alleviated through particular symbols of being in control of a situation. And that affects then, by having that understanding, I don't then treat the person dismissively, but I guard how I interact with them. And I interact with them differently than I would, which is that, like, I try to, depending on what my goal is in the situation, but even if my goal is just like to survive the encounter, I'm going to probably not try to challenge that need for safety and feeling like things are predictable. Because a lot of time, control there also means predictable, right? That means that they're afraid of surprises and things being unpredictable. And so I would try my best to not make any sudden movements, but also, yeah, just be very gentle in my manner. Unless my goal is something different. If my goal is, if getting what I want is if I want to try to make this person, for example, feel like shit or feel small or feel ridiculous, probably I can't, because they probably don't respect me enough to care what I say. But I might still want to try. So let's think about this a little bit. Some other tools I want to add. So listening for understanding. Some things that I would encourage you is to think about on a scale. Sorry, I have dark mode on, so you can't see it super well. We have 2, usually 1 sometimes, and 0 rarely. And think of yourself on a scale from 0 to 2. I allow the other person to finish what they are saying before I speak. I pay attention even when I don't like the speaker. I easily ignore distractions when I'm listening. I can easily remember what other people say to me. Obviously, neurodivergence and things like ADHD or other things can impact this, but think of within your baseline, right? This is not universal statements. This is from your baseline. Are these things true? Usually, sometimes, or rarely from your baseline. So relative to your context. I ask the speaker questions when I don't understand something. I look at people when they are talking to me. I don't do other things when I'm listening. I keep listening even when the message is too complicated, and I ignore behavior or appearances that bother me and listen to what the speaker is saying. So these can be difficult, right? Like I can get very distracted by things like repetitive arrhythmic sounds or motions. And it can be something where I can feel really overstimulated by that very quickly. And I can also get distracted by things like if someone's got something in their teeth. And if I catch myself doing that, I can use other tools that I have from self-awareness to kind of set it aside for now. And, I think for a lot of us, we tend to think that we're good listeners. Most of us are pretty shit listeners. And just working on this. So this is during. If you want to reduce the risk of things really blowing up and you feeling like shit afterwards, these are good things to do, because even if you're talking to someone where you find what they're saying to be fundamentally abhorrent, now maybe for maintaining self-respect, what makes sense to you is to shut it down and walk away, right? That's completely fine. But if that is not what's going to make you feel best about the situation, or that is not your goal, doing your best to really try to understand what the person is saying is going to help, especially if your long-term goal is to change that person's mind. You will never be able to change someone's mind if you don't really understand where they're coming from and they don't feel seen and respected by you. You also really can't change someone's mind. You can only help them want to change their own mind. And related to that, I know I've shared it 1,000,001 times, and I'm sorry, this is like poorly cropped right now, but on our YouTube channel, Consent Academy has a YouTube channel, if you didn't know. We have a lot of videos, including a lecture I did, that's not what I'm trying to do, many, many years ago through another nonprofit that I was a part of in Seattle called 314 Action. And this is about communicating controversial science. It was technically called Speaking STEM, Communicating Controversial Science. And it was mostly given to scientists about how do you deal with science deniers. And what I talk about here is fundamentally, how do you change someone's mind without it becoming an argument? How do you disagree without conflict? How do you, it says here, ever wondered how to combat misinformation, science denial, conspiracy theories, racisms? Do you dread the holidays and having to listen to your trademark racist uncle? Do you want to know how to change someone's mind in an effective, kind, and consensual manner, or how you could disagree with someone without conflict? Watch this video and learn how. So it's me and someone who works at Joya Del Ria, who works at the Pacific Science Center. It is about 2 hours long, but I really do genuinely recommend it. It's got nice chapters here, so you can work through it. And the audio has been improved. Someone volunteered for Consent Academy just to improve the audio quality of this. So I really recommend using the skills here. And let's look at a couple of other things. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to reorganize the screen one more time. Probably not the last time, but we will see. Alrighty. So thinking on these things, reflecting on them, and trying to bring that into your interactions with people. Active listening is, let's talk about what passive listening is first. Passive listening is silent, one-directional, not responsive or reflexive, thinking about what you want to say, not what is being said, and may lead to misunderstanding. Whereas active listening tends to be mindful, you tend to show interest and engagement, you reflect or paraphrase. This is really important because sometimes when you reflect back to somebody what they have said or communicated to you, or where you paraphrase it, it actually helps them reprocess what they believe. And this is one of the things that's helpful in therapeutic practices, but it's also helpful in pushing back against certain ideas, because sometimes when someone hears it coming out of someone else's mouth, they can be like, oh, that sounds really silly. Not always, though. And you want to, try to validate feelings. So then, some other things that I want to talk about boundaries more specifically, but one other idea first is how to articulate what you really want to say to somebody. So let's say you actually want to disagree. How do you articulate? So you want to be concise and precise. So make it as short and specific as possible. So you can take time before you respond to these things. I know in especially white Western culture, there's very much this idea of like conversation being like playing ping pong, where it really needs to be this sort of back and forth. But that is not the only way to have conversation. Sometimes people who come from other backgrounds people might think that they're not really listening or they're not very engaged because they take a lot of time to think before responding. This is very common in Indigenous culture, especially North American Indigenous culture, of like really responding very slowly to things, really taking time. But you can say to somebody, hey, I need a minute to think about this before I respond to you, and ask them to respect that. You want to use things that are not all or nothing statements. Try not to use the always, the never, the forever. Focus on I statements like we talked about previously. Try to use clarity and transparency. Be honest with people. Try to be kind. Even if you're telling someone what you think of what they're saying, try very hard to focus on, okay, let me back up. You always want to ask yourself, what is more important? Do I want to be as effective as possible? Do I want to feel as good as possible after this? Do I want to feel like I really dunked on someone? Like, these are all valid, right? These are all very valid, but they can be mutually exclusive. You are very unlikely to change someone's mind if they feel like you made them look like a fool. That tends to actually lead to more backlash and more doubling down. Whereas if somebody feels as though through disagreeing with them that they were not personally attacked, which can be really hard to do. Some people are very fragile. Some people are very fragile. But if you reduce the risk of that, you're more likely to be very effective and to change somebody's mind. But if that's not your goal, like, you don't have to do this. For serious, you don't have to. And then be honest with people and try to validate their experience of things while also telling them, to fuck off. And so then let's talk about boundaries just a little bit. So this is, as you can see, some of this is from an earlier version of our Consent for Leadership series. I do really want to recommend it. You do not have to be in any kind of leadership to take it and to benefit from it. You can take the classes a la carte if you want. You don't have to take the whole series. But we have to talk a lot about if you're in any position of leadership, formal, informal, potential, future, whatever, it can be really useful to have certain types of skills, even just daily life. But boundary skills, we can call boundaries as good fences. And if you can think about it, a fence can be a lot of different things. A fence could be this, right? Like this white picket fence, which has got a lot of gaps in it. It's pretty low. It would be very easy to talk to somebody over it. But a boundary can also be like, a 10-foot thick steel wall that's 100 miles high or something, like that's another type of boundary. Boundaries are not one thing, and they're not the same for everybody. So think about, what are some examples of mundane everyday boundaries that we have, and how do we communicate those boundaries? So some examples I can think about are, a lot of us have boundaries around how close we expect people to stand to us when they're talking to us, and how that has to do with how comfortable we feel. It's very cultural, but it also can be individual. Sorry, I wanted to put my feet up on this little stool, and I wanted to make sure my cat was not sitting on it. I don't want to kick them. We can also, not necessarily want people to touch us. We can also have ideas about, what we're comfortable with talking about it with strangers, right? A lot of people find it really uncomfortable if you're standing waiting for a bus or you're in line at a store and someone just starts talking to you about some very heavy subjects. Whereas other people that might be like perfectly nice and they might be like, oh, I'm so glad we're not having small talk. And it's different for everybody. And how do we communicate these boundaries? A lot of the time it's nonverbal. There's, consent frameworks that are these sort of like default modes um, that we have with what we expect to be normal in public, with strangers, with neighbors. Again, the whole idea of like saying that making food for new neighbors and bringing it over to be nice, that is not inherently a consent violation. Um, that is very normal within many cultural contexts. And if the neighbor rejected it and said, no, thank you, and don't make me food, you would just update your consent framework with them and say, okay. And if they said, oh, this is so sweet, but like I'm a vegetarian and you made me, chili with beef in it, you could just say, oh, cool, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. Right? This is most of our boundaries that we communicate daily are things that are within sort of consent frameworks, sort of default ways of doing things. We might not realize we have frameworks for these things, but we do. And, you know, um, sorry, I'm very sick and I can feel like my sinuses getting fuller. It's really a bummer that I got sick because I don't like leave the house. I work from home. If I go out, I like masked and I only ever go out really with Charlie. If we're gonna go run an errand, I might go for a walk by myself or occasionally go sit in the park or something. But for the most part, I'm home. And Charlie goes to work every day. Charlie gets a lot less sick than I do. I don't think of myself as like delicate of constitution, but compared to Charlie, I must be because I get sick a lot more often. Um, anyway, continuing. Yeah, Paladin Hulk, I need the plate back in 1 hour. Then, this is one of those things where it's really good to communicate about that. Because if you have this expectation of the person's going to bring the plate back right away, you should probably tell them that. And then they might say, there's no way we're going to be able to eat this in 1 hour. We get into a lot of trouble and actually can damage a lot of relationships when we don't communicate things or we wait for things to become a problem. Or also when, I've had plenty of house guests that just like steamroll so many sort of like culturally normative boundaries so quickly that I'm like, I'm not even going to try because this is just not going to be good. Like they come in, they've broken a bunch of stuff, they've like used, what are clearly fancy special occasion chopsticks and completely burned off all the lacquer on the tips, so now they're ruined. And they've like, just done all this stuff and like uh they're a hot mess and like it's fine. It's fine. Like I'm not even if we had this conversation, we'd be having it for like a million years. Next time before they come over and stay over, I'm just gonna have to set some ground rules with them. And that's my way of doing things, right? Where I can say it's more important for me to like not make this person feel like absolute shit because they've just broken so many sort of norms so quickly than to care about, things that I could easily replace. Seeing as I get most of my stuff secondhand anyway, it's fine. And Aradin, I mean, that is the hallmark of so many TV shows. If people honestly communicated, the show would be 5 to 10 minutes long. For serious, for serious. Now there's like how there's some movie I saw a while ago. Um, oh, what was it called? I'll have to look it up, but it was like this woman gets married to this guy and like his first wife died. And it's this like kind of thriller and like the maid is kind of like obsessed with the first wife and like it seems like there's like maybe he killed her or maybe something happened or this and that and maybe the new husband actually like really hates her and in the end like the resolution of it was just so stupid because of the fact that like none of the oh, maybe this or maybe this was real. So you were like set up for all of these wondering things. And it all came down to the fact that like they just didn't communicate very basic things. Like, I hated my first wife and she was abusive to me. And I feel guilty about the fact that, you know, she died and I feel a little bit relieved. And instead, the new wife is led to believe that the first wife was like this impossibly amazing woman. And so then she like tries to dress up like her, and then the guy is like freaked out by it. And it's like, just say literally anything to each other. You could literally just say, I did not like my first wife and I had a difficult relationship with her. And that would have fixed literally the entire story. I had a hard time with that movie because I was just, when it ended, I was like, are you kidding me? Really? Uh, it's true. We can do the exact same thing in real life, but there's some movies and books and TV shows that I think take it to the extreme. Okay, boundary skills. Let's come back to this. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is from this leadership series. They're kind of leadership related, but you can kind of imagine. Imagine you're a popular dance teacher. At this event, there are classes in the morning and dance parties with live music in the evening. You're paid well, but technically only paid for your teaching time. You're allowed to attend evening dances for free, and tonight a band that you really love dancing to will be playing, but you know that many of the attendees of the event will want to dance with you, so you can't just dance with your friends. We can also think about this when it comes to our family, where you might think that like, I really like being with my family and my family really likes to make fun of each other and make jokes, and there are certain things that are really hurtful to me if they make jokes about them. And I know that they're going to want to tease each other. So I have, for example, told my family there are certain things that are 10,000% off limits. There's a couple of things that if they ever brought it up again or said certain things again to me, said to them, I will just literally never talk to you again. There are some things where it was the kind of thing I only ever had to say once. And like, it was definitely something where they said it and they weren't really thinking about it and they thought they were being funny. And I was just like, no, I'm shutting that down. I'm not going to stand for this. But there are other things where I say to them, hey, I'm not going to tolerate you joking about my body. I don't want you to joke that, I'm fat in any kind of way. I got so many jokes about my body as a kid. It gave me all these complexes. It's off limits. There are a million other things you can joke about. If you want to make fun of me, I accept that this is how you show affection and this is how you like to banter. Make fun of things that I do. I'm a very strange person with many idiosyncrasies. I say really weird things all the time, I know. Charlie, half of the jokes Charlie makes are him literally just repeating back to me something I just said or like reenacting something I just did and like me getting to see how weird I am. And it never makes me feel like shit. So this is one of those things where I've had to set boundaries with my family and say, hey, it's not that you can't tease me. There are plenty of things to tease me about, but do not tease me about these things that are like maybe not actually jokes and maybe actually covert criticisms, because I don't want to have it. And I say to them like, hey, if you're going to do this, I'm just going to leave. I'm going to go home. And then you have to decide like what is more important for you, making the joke or having me hear. Right? So then let's talk about what a boundary is. A boundary is a declaration or limit that says where I end and where you begin. A limit or an edge that defines me as separate from something or someone else. A line in the metaphorical sand. It can be a physical boundary, an emotional, a mental, or a spiritual boundary. There are lots of different ways boundaries can take shape. And, there may be things where I don't want to go to certain places with some people, and that's okay, right? And so boundaries are important. They help us avoid misunderstandings. They prevent resentment. They decrease burnout and they build trust. They're also necessary for well-being and they're necessary for leadership, but they're also necessary for the longevity of connections with people. If we never set boundaries with people, or we set boundaries and then we don't enforce them, or we set boundaries and then immediately take it back, we're likely to erode that relationship and it's going to build to a lot of resentment. So So how do you communicate a boundary effectively? You want to state your limits simply, clearly, and specifically. What is the boundary I'm actually setting? State the consequence for crossing the limit. The consequence should not be something you will do to the other person, right? This is not that it gets into places where it can get really non-consensual really quickly, and it can also lead to coercion, right? You can set a boundary with somebody. Let's say you really want to have sex with someone. And I want to talk about, I think, an example of how the difference between coercion in a sexual scenario and a boundary in a sexual scenario. So I might say, I'm on a date with someone and they invite me to come up to their apartment. I might say to them, hey, I only want to go up there if you really want to have sex with me. If you don't want to have sex with me, that's okay. However, I'm going to go home and masturbate or something. Or like, I'm gonna go try to meet someone else at the bar. I'm really in the mood. I want to have sex with someone, so I'm gonna go do this other thing. And letting them know, like, this doesn't mean I never want to talk to you again. This doesn't mean this is the end of our connection with each other. This just means I have a need right now. I'm inviting you to participate in this need with me. And if you're not interested, I'm going to go attend to this need on my own in some other way. Right. So now it is still perfectly reasonable that the person says yes, and then we get back to their apartment and, a little bit of time goes by and they realize that they're not in the mood, and they're absolutely allowed to change their mind. But I'm also still allowed to say, I respect this and I'm going to go because I still have a need that I want to attend to. These are completely reasonable things. I can also change my mind about that and say, okay, now that I'm here, I'm having a really good time. I accept that you've changed your mind about sexual activity with me, and like, I'm down to just, give each other a shoulder massage, or we can just like watch a movie or something like that. Another example of this might be saying to a friend, hey, I'm down to come visit you in the city and go out partying together as long as I can stay at your house. If I cannot stay at your house that night, I'm not going to come into the city. That's a boundary, right? And maybe the friend can change their mind. And if that friend changes their mind, I might have to say to them something along the lines of like, okay, I really, I'm too drunk or I'm too tired to safely drive home. So I'm going to have to either take an expensive Lyft or Uber or rideshare or whatever, or I'm going to need to stay somewhere else. Can you help me with this? And if they're really not interested in that, I might say, okay, like, I respect that you're giving me a no for these things. And that means I'm not going to feel comfortable, doing this thing again in the future. We can still hang out, but I'm not going to come up in this sort of way unless I have a guarantee of a place to stay for the night. There can be extenuating circumstances, of course, but these are perfectly acceptable types of boundaries to have. And the boundary is about stating your limits. Your sort of, this is what I need, and if I can't get these things that I need, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. The way that it could be coercive is if you start to imply other types of things. Like, if you say no to me, then I'm going to tell everybody this thing. If you say no to me, then like, I'm never going to talk to you again and I'm going to hate you forever. That's much more coercive. That is not the same thing as setting a boundary. And you're absolutely right, Aradin. You can revoke consent at any time on either end. And revoking consent is not non-consensual, right? Like, it can get complicated because there can be times where both parties might be upholding and violating each other's consent simultaneously, right? Like, if I said, I'm only going to come into the city and go out partying with you if I can stay at your house, and then you tell me at the end, no, because you just don't feel like having a guest over, I mean, that's a shitty thing to do. You're allowed to do that. I can't force you to let me stay there, but that would probably damage our friendship, right? And so I can still say, like, hey, this would be a huge violation of the trust that I put in you and like the whole agreement that we had about why I was going to come up here and the guaranteeing of a place to stay. And if I can't stay here, that's going to damage the relationship. I'm going to trust you less. So this is one of those things that where we have to be very careful with it. But okay, so how do we use it? We use direct and honest statements, and we use non-judgmental, me-centered statements, the I statements. We don't want to talk about who the other person is. Like, I'm going to not feel as much trust if, you go back on this promise that you made to me. And not like you are an asshole. It's going to be like, I'm not going to trust you anymore. And then respond. You want to keep your responses consistent as much as possible and take responsive action or enforce your stated consequence. The consequence can only really ever be about what you are going to do, right? You can't make somebody do something and you don't want to then behave non-consensually towards them. So you can say, hey, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. I'm not going to come back in the same kind of way. I'm not going to trust you as much. You're going to have to do something to repair this trust. But that is, and they're allowed to set boundaries back, right? This is the other thing to remember is like they're allowed to also be like, well, okay, if this is how your boundary is going to go, this will be my boundary. And sometimes it can get coercive. People can do that as a way to try to get you to pull back on your boundaries. Okay, so there's different types of boundaries we can have: emotional, material, time and energy, mental and spiritual, and physical. And what happens when boundaries get crossed? Boundary crossing has a significant emotional impact a lot of the time. Not always, but it can. Boundary crossing can hurt or damage someone's sense of their identity. Boundary crossing can erode trust and safety, and everyone accidentally crosses boundaries. It's about what you do when it happens. So, when you cross someone else's boundary, what we recommend is recognize what happened, acknowledge the cross boundary and accept responsibility, apologize for the mistake, ask for clarification on the boundary, and take steps to avoid doing it again. And this can be really tough because sometimes when we go into stressful situations, we can get so activated and so stressed out that we practice poor consent and where we behave non-consensually towards other people or we violate their boundaries, or we might say things that are really hurtful that we don't actually mean for the sake of hurting somebody or for the sake of giving a reaction, or we might say something really hurtful as a really poorly communicated boundary, right? I'm so stressed out by the things you're saying to me, I'm going to say something so hurtful that it shuts down the whole conversation or diverts the topic to something else. That is setting a boundary in a sense that's saying, I don't want to talk about this thing anymore, but it's not following the guidelines, right? It's not being specific, it's not being clear, it's not being focused on what you actually want to communicate, and it's not being kind either. All right, what did you say, Aradan? I've done that before. I'll go to this thing, but if I say I really need to leave, then we need to leave, then and there. Yeah, and I mean, you can't necessarily make other people do things, but what we can do with boundaries there is just say like, okay, if I say I need to leave, then I'm going to leave. Charlie does this with me a lot. Like I might want to stay up later than him. I might be really focused on like, oh, just 5 more minutes of this. Oh my goodness, I just need a little bit more. And it's okay. Because what's going to happen there is we don't have to make it into a thing. Charlie can just say to me, cool, like you want to keep playing this game for a few more minutes. I respect that. I really want to go get ready for bed and get into bed. And we don't have to be like completely like this all the time with each other. And that's both of us setting a boundary. That's me saying, hey, I still have a need. I need a few more minutes in order to feel satisfied with my relaxation time. And Charlie is saying, I need to begin my process of getting ready for bed now so I don't feel really tired in the morning. And it's okay that we have different needs there. And it's okay that we both act on our needs and keep a boundary with each other. Charlie might say, I'm going to go, if you're going to stay up late, I would really love it if you could sleep on, the bed that we have in my office rather than the one in our bedroom so that I don't disturb him. And that might be a thing that we negotiate with each other, right? Okay. Um, and Rodney said, well, they were my ride, so there was really no way for me to just leave on my own. Right. And this is something you want to very much negotiate as much as possible ahead of time. Okay, so then when you cross someone's boundaries, again, recognize what happened, acknowledge it, accept responsibility, and actually apologize and try to avoid doing it again. This can be hard to do when we're pissed off or really upset, but it is still important. We don't want to behave non-consensually to someone because we're upset. Okay, so then when your boundary is crossed, you need to recognize what happened, state that the boundary has been crossed, follow through with the stated consequence, like I'm going to leave, restate the boundary, and determine if the boundary needs to be reevaluated or renegotiated. Sometimes boundary crossings happen because the things were poorly communicated, or the agreement that you came to originally is not necessarily possible for everybody involved. And the core of the boundary is still important to you, but the shape that it's going to take may need to be renegotiated. And this can be really helpful if, let's say you're polyamorous and your family doesn't get it, right? You know, Plenty of things that my family doesn't get about the way I've lived my life. And for the most part, I'm very lucky because my family is pretty down to just be like, I don't get it, but you do you. And as long as you're happy and no one's doing anything bad to you, I'm comfortable with it. And I think that that's a happy medium, right? Like, I don't need them to understand every niche aspect of my life, just like I don't need to understand every niche aspect of theirs. However, there have been times where it didn't gel so well. And so let's say, for example, you're polyamorous and you want to bring multiple partners home for Thanksgiving, if you're celebrating Thanksgiving or any holiday that you might celebrate. And your parents might say, hey, I'm not comfortable with that. Or like your grandmother would just be so devastated and so confused. You would want to negotiate on this, right? Like you could say to them, are you comfortable with me bringing my partners so you get to meet them, but we introduce them to grandmother as they are my friends? That can be a good in between. Now, we often really infantilize people who are older than us, especially the people who are elderly. They may understand more than you realize, and that is something important to keep in mind. But if your family members are wanting to use the idea of not upsetting someone as like a cudgel against you and like as a way of criticizing your behavior, saying, why do you have to be this way? Can't you realize how upsetting it is to X person? That's really different, right? That's not sort of very nice behavior. You're right, Arad, and grandma might just be good with it. But you can negotiate these things. But you might also want to say to them, hey, I understand that you don't totally vibe with what I'm doing with my life, and I don't want to get into a conversation about it. I'm only going to come to this holiday event if you are comfortable not talking to me about X, Y, or Z thing. I don't want to talk about how Trump is saying he's running for reelection. I've got family members that I love dearly, and like they voted for Bernie Sanders and then they voted for Trump, and I'm like, I don't want to talk about it with you. I don't have the energy for that. We don't see each other often enough for that. And like, I just don't want to get into that. There are people for whom I'm just like, it is more important to me that I get to see you the once every 5 years that I do, and that it's a pleasant experience rather than me trying. I don't have enough of a relationship with that person to change their feelings about who they vote for. But I might still need to set a boundary there, which is that I don't want to talk to you about Trump. I don't want to hear his name. That is my boundary. if you bring him up, I'm just going to leave. And so you have to decide if you want to see me badly enough to not talk about this thing. And even with people who, I'm like politically aligned with, I might still say, hey, I don't want to talk about Trump. I'm exhausted. If you all want to talk about Trump, that's fine, but I'm going to go home once you start doing that. It's okay to set those boundaries, and you want to just be honest about it. So, a couple other things to think about with setting boundaries. There's this great little comic here, and it's got this person and their arms are up and they say, I'm triggered, so I'm yelling mean things at you, and you have to listen because I had a difficult childhood. And this person standing next to them who's listening is like their hands on their head and they're thinking, I feel compassion for the very real trauma, but does that mean I have to get traumatized too? And then the text underneath them says, having empathy for someone else's difficult past does not mean you have to accept present day abusive behaviors. So it's important to be careful around things like secondary trauma. Secondary trauma can happen through, witnessing somebody else's trauma, hearing about somebody else's trauma, but also just being exposed to harmful behaviors because people are having a rough time. And in our Consent for Leadership series, we talk about this from the perspective of like, people often use terms like victim-led or trauma-informed in ways that are too broad. And this can encourage us to become passive in our work. And we can end up allowing someone who's maybe harmed in a situation to sort of take over the situation in a way that's not good for anybody involved, including the person who was harmed. Because if they're still processing trauma that they experienced, they're not necessarily going to be in the best position to know what's best for the person who harmed them or like the organization that oversaw the event where something happened. It's a little bit of a digression, but if everybody, one of the things that this is how it is related though, is if we all get dysregulated with each other in a conversation, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to do a good job of bringing each other back down. So one of the boundaries you can set here is to just practice walking away. It doesn't mean you leave. It can, but it can also mean you just go to the bathroom for a few minutes. That was like my go-to as a teenager. When I needed some privacy, I just went into the bathroom. Or you go outside, you go for a walk, you spend a few minutes checking your phone, and you can even suggest to everybody, hey, let's like take a 5-minute break to cool off before we come back. Okay, the next one, this is a tool I really want to encourage you all to take a look at. It's a modified version of several competencies in psychology that I made, and it's for setting boundaries. And it's like a step-by-step guide if you're unsure of how to set a boundary. So you want to summarize the situation, what is happening currently, but just the facts. Don't put any emotion into it yet, and use non-judgmental language. Then you want to express the impact of what has happened. What is the effect that the situation is having on you? So it can be like, hey, beforehand we talked about not talking about X thing, but we have started talking about it, and it's making me feel really stressed out and like my boundaries aren't being respected. And then you want to ask for something as simple and as clear of an ask as possible. And you can say something like, I would like us to stop talking about X. And then support. So you want to support your ask with reasons, or if possible, why will also benefit them. If we can stop talking about this, I'll stay in the conversation. It will make me feel more comfortable. Then the on topic, keep it to just the current situation. Don't bring up other issues. And remember, if they try to bring up other issues, you can always just say, hey, that's something we should talk about, but right now we're talking about this. And then negotiate, but only if they say no. And you want to try to stay gentle and calm as much as possible. Do this the entire time. As much as you can, try to use a gentle tone and language. You can also be firm. You can also express frustration while still being very skillful in these things. And this is just a way to increase the likelihood that somebody will respect what you're saying and not try to argue with you about it. If your goal is not to get them to respect this boundary, if your goal is to like express how you're feeling, you do not need to use this. You can just tell people, hey, you're being an asshole and you need to fuck off right now, or whatever you want to say. This is just one tool that you can use. And some other things that we can do to reduce the risk of things really impacting us is, especially with secondary trauma, if this is a thing that comes up, is you want to have, and especially for after, this is the other part, is before you get into the situation, you want to have a plan for how you're going to take care of yourself after the fact. That's the last bit I want to talk about today. What are you going to do to take care of yourself after the situation is over? Because if you don't have a plan, even if everything is pretty good, you should still do something to take care of yourself afterward, because just the risk of things blowing up or becoming tense or frustrating can be a lot to carry. And if you don't have a plan, you increase the risk of not processing the situation or of getting, like other kinds of impacts. Like you might find yourself having a mystery stomach ache, or like a migraine that just won't go away, or difficulty sleeping, or, no energy for things. We want to reduce the risk of that. So create a plan and engage in it within 48 hours after the situation is over. So you want to have stress relief methods, exercise if that works for you, mindfulness practices if that works for you, whatever works for you. But create a plan. Don't just think, I'll just relax when I get home. What is that actually going to look like? Because relaxing is not all created equal. There are things that are really useful for me in some scenarios, like spending a few minutes on social media can be good if I need to just like sort of give my brain a mini break. But if I need to like not be stressed out, social media is pretty much not what I should look at, because most of the time it's depressing. So taking a step back from that can be really useful, and having a plan for what is actually going to be the most helpful for me here. Next, talk to people. Create as much as you can a good support system, and talk with people who maybe also had difficult experiences with family, or confidants, or therapists, friends, whoever. And then you want to also increase your capacity in the long term. More time between stressful experiences can be really helpful. Practice working with your own trauma. And as far as trauma goes, everybody experiences lowercase t traumas. It's part of the human experience. Many of us will experience uppercase T traumas, like big T traumas, things that have a sort of lasting impact that can be lifelong or last for many years in terms of like having a large impact on us. But most of us have multiple experiences with lowercase t traumas, and it's part of life. But they're not always things that just like you experience it and then you process it for a little while, it gets integrated and you move on. It can still be things that affect us now and then. And work on healing from your stresses and traumas. Work on, how can I let go of? How can I process? How can I resolve things, maybe needs that have built up in me from my childhood, from past experiences, that are never going to happen, right? Like if you need a certain type of approval, for example, from a parent, and you know that it's like pretty much never going to happen, and you feel some kind of trauma or stress or ache because you don't have this kind of approval from them, when you have to start by recognizing this and recognizing that it might not happen, and then learning to find other ways to get that approval or that esteem, and not necessarily through people who are also similarly unlikely to give it to you. That is a common problem a lot of us run into, which is that like we try to have these corrective experiences where we sort of rehash out things that were not satisfactory in our childhood and hope to have a different resolution this time, and most of the time it doesn't work. But figure out, what are other ways I can build up my esteem? What are other ways I can build up my sense of being comfortable in myself and giving myself the approval that I'm looking for? Um, this is just one of many examples. All right, so basically that's everything I wanted to talk about today. It has been 2 hours and 10 minutes. I'm feeling pretty tired, so I think I'm going to want to wrap up here. Rodden, you said, I want to look at what you said. Also, these days, it seems a lot of people try to claim the victim by misrepresenting what they've been through, either to either garner sympathy or to get away with problematic behavior. The past few years have severely eroded my faith in people. Yeah, mistreating people or doing things that are not consensual or not okay simply because you have trauma is a bit of a bullshit. Like it might be a reason for your behaviors, but again, it's not an excuse. And being a victim or being harmed or being traumatized or having problems never is an excuse for hurting people or doing things non-consensually. And it's not an excuse for getting out of, other responsibilities that you might have. You might need a reprieve every once in a while, but like there's a difference, right? And then Aranya also said, I mean, the whole world has had trauma the past couple of years due to COVID and everything connected to it. Yes. All right. So thank you all for joining me today. I really want to recommend that you check us out on social media, especially if you follow us on Twitter. We'll still keep, the lights on at Twitter for as long as we can. Um, and let me just actually, I have a summary of what we talked about here today. So let me just make this better sized. So here we talked about having plans for before, during, and after. Focus this week on charging up your mental and emotional batteries. Make a plan for how you will take care of yourself after the event. Decide what you want to prioritize between maintaining self-respect, maintaining the relationship, or getting something that you want. And after, act on your self-care plan within 48 hours. And yeah, there's not a Consent Academy Mastodon account because I don't really understand how Mastodon works. And it seems to be a bit more of a hot mess in many ways than Twitter because like whoever runs any given Mastodon server has access to everybody's DMs and like people often direct message us with really sort of confidential and private information. So I don't totally feel good about setting up a Mastodon account right now for many reasons, but that being one of them. The other thing is, if you are interested, check out our Patreon. And we have a few more classes coming up this year. Not this weekend, but not next weekend, but the weekend after that, we have our consent and leadership class on Beyond the Ban, options for accountability. And if you're just interested, even for your own personal life, on different ways you can take accountability for maybe harm that you have caused, but that are not doing nothing or completely removing yourself from a community or a space, you can benefit from that class. So check out our website. We also have a few more consent basics coming up this year and several other things that are free. So check out our calendar, and our 2023 calendar should be up soon. We have lots of good things in store for next year. Thank you all so much for joining me today. And I will hopefully talk to you all Tuesday. Thank you. Bye.